Hello, everyone. Welcome to our next NAA webinar. You are joining us for the first of two webinars, Embracing the Power of Nature for Watershed Recovery. So there are two webinars in this series. Today's is Case Studies in Nature-Based Approaches to Restoring Watersheds. And then on Tuesday, May 7th, it'll be the second part of this series, Process-Based Stream Recovery Strategies. We want to thank the Department of Interior for their generous support of this program. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit more about our May 7 program, the Process-Based Stream Recovery Strategies. Reed Whittlesey, a Restoration Program Director of Rio Grande Return, will consider process-based strategies for stream recovery that embrace the power of nature. This webinar will emphasize natural techniques using plants and the reintroduction of beaver to support nature's ability to restore ecological systems. And now I would like to get started. But before I introduce today's presenters, just a few housekeeping items. If you wish to use captions during this program, please select Show Captions, which is located on the navigation bar of your Zoom screen. And we also encourage you to participate in today's session by posting comments or shared resources, which often happens during these programs, in chat. If you would please post all questions in Q&A, that will help us to keep track of them and not lose them in chat, and we will answer as many as possible towards the end of the program. Both Chris and Garrett are happy to respond to your questions. And please know that this program is being recorded, so everyone who's registered for the webinar will receive a link to the recording in about a week. And now let's talk about our speakers today. We're delighted to welcome Garrett Altmann, Western Restoration Program Manager of the Environmental Policy Innovation Center, or EPIC. Garrett supports tribes and communities and access for federal funding for fish passive projects. Prior to joining EPIC, he served as the GIS coordinator and project manager for the Forestry Department at the Santa Clara Pueblo. Garrett is versed at integrating indigenous knowledge and nature-based solutions in projects to maximize ecosystem services and develop resilience to climate variability. Garrett has coordinated watershed restoration projects with federal, state, tribal, and non-governmental organizations and continues to innovate in projects that maximize nature, mitigate disasters, and restore aquatic connectivity. He holds a bachelor's in geography from UC Santa Barbara and a master's in natural resources management from the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. He'll be joined today by Dr. Christopher Haring. Dr. Haring is a professional geologist with over 25 years of experience in hydrology and hydraulics, river engineering, restoration, and stabilization, with a focus on fluvial and geomorphology with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. He is a research physical scientist with the River Engineering Branch at the Engineering Research Development Corp, ERDC. And his work experience includes studies in hydrologic and hydraulic analysis of watersheds, geomorphic watershed assessments, wildfire recovery, riverbed bank stabilization studies, and projects using grade control structures, redirective and bank erosion control measures in combination with engineering and nature-based, natural-based features. He also serves on the USACE River Engineering Committee that aids the USACE districts on solving water resource and river engineering problems.
Excellent. Thank you, Moira. Thanks for having us, and thank you everyone for attending today. Chris and I are excited to be here and talk about some of the work we've been involved with over the close to a decade now, primarily out at Santa Clara Pueblo in New Mexico, but extending a lot of the work we've done into national applications. So with that, I'm going to switch to slideshow view to make sure we're all on the same page here. Today we'll be talking about the examples that will be primarily focused on Santa Clara Pueblo from a case study perspective, but we're going to be tying in a lot of national applications, and the intent is to provide these applications examples in a context to where you can transition them to your prospective watersheds wherever you may be throughout the country or in the world even. With Santa Clara Pueblo, they've been affected by natural disasters, primarily fires and floods. We've implemented a variety of recovery strategies, which we'll go through in detail today in the presentation. but the majority of these have focused on that natural component and nature-based features and applications. We'll discuss how the tribe of Santa Clara has come up with a naturalistic model for water resources development. Again, lots of examples. We have a lot of pictures to show you today. That's what we're all here for, to learn from that implementation perspective. So that's another big goal we have for you today. And then lastly, a conclusion path forward. So to get started with the tribe here in New Mexico, Santa Clara Pueblo is a federally recognized Native American tribe. We're located in north central New Mexico along the Rio Grande. We have a population of 3,500, of which half are tribal members. And the area encompassing the Pueblo is 90 square miles. Central to this Pueblo is the Santa Clara Creek Watershed. It's a 32,000 acre watershed that's central to the Pueblo, both
Garrett,
physically.
Garrett, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we're not seeing the slides.
Did it not transition over?
No, we need to share screen there.
I don't think we shared screen. I apologize. 1 second.
While you're doing that, Garrett, I just want to say a few introductory words as well. It's a great pleasure to be presenting today to the NAA, and thanks, Maura, for working with us. Garrett and I have been working together, like Garrett mentioned, close to a decade, and the work that we've been doing in the Santa Clara Pueblo has been really second to none as far as the coordination and just the really, really hard work that the Pueblo has been working on to implement NNBF and other strategies. The coordination has just been incredible. So we're going to talk a little bit about applications in other parts of the country, but this is really a case study for the Santa Clara Pueblo and how to effectively work with the programs and the partners and implement NNBF and continue that work into the future. So it's been a pleasure working with Garrett, and I'm looking forward to continuing to work with him and the Pueblo in the future. Thanks, Garrett.
Thanks, Chris. All right, so we should be able to see screen here. So back to Santa Clara. Yes, it's been a really tremendous journey. As a non-tribal member and coming in and working with the tribe and understanding what those cultural needs are and how those priorities can be either complemented or work with a lot of Western science and engineering perspectives. There's been a lot of challenges and difficulties, but really learning what that indigenous knowledge is and what those priorities are and how that can transfer and overlap. And where it doesn't in some cases. So we'll be covering that today. So getting back to the physiography of the region, this watershed is central to the Pueblo, both culturally and physically, as I mentioned. The stream is a source of life, not just for the physicality and the biology of the region, but culturally, they view the stream as a living entity. And it's supposed to be regarded as such and prioritized above all other infrastructure and developments that go on in the region. The watershed has a tremendous elevational gradient from 5,400 to over 10,000 feet. So with that, you get a variety of ecosystems from the cottonwood galleries and bosque systems along the Rio Grande up to the high desert grasslands, the pinyon juniper, the ponderosa pine forest, the mixed conifer, and even in that high altitude, we have some alpine tundra biomes. So really geographically diverse, and lots of vegetation types, lots of animals and wildlife that depend on these. And within this system, we had native Rio Grande cutthroat trout. They were prioritized as a species, and actually there was a call and reintroduction to have just native fish in the upper watershed after they've been hybridized for 60, 70 years with stocking. And just prior to that reintroduction, we had a large-scale fire breakout, which we'll cover next. But we had 100% fish kill in the watershed, 100% beaver eradication. And as a result, the watershed's really gone through this successional restart that we're having to work within. But prior to that fire and the flooding, there were 4 ponds in this canyon. These ponds were highly regarded for recreational fishing. They're originally for irrigation and water storage. But that recreational component and being open to the general public also became not just the primary source of economic revenue for the tribe, but also another source of identity where people really regarded Santa Clara Canyon as a place to go and recreate.
Hey Garrett, before you move on to
Yes.
the next, can you go back to the watershed slide there just quick? And for the audience, Garrett and I are going to kind of go back and forth. This is a little bit different maybe than a normal presentation, just talking about slides and some of the key points. I just wanted to bring up, because this slide really kind of pinpoints, at least from a plan view perspective, of this canyon and the entire reach down to the Rio Grande. We've got a lot of different physical processes going on in this watershed, from the steeper slopes in the upper canyon, transitioning down through some of the kind of really narrow parts of the canyon, and then opening back up as we get down towards the alluvial fan and the Rio Grande connection. So we're going to talk a little bit about process-based designs. We're going to talk a little bit about NMDF. Most of the time, those things really interfinger, and when they do connect, then that is really the best perspective. We'll talk about a little bit about the constraints of some of these environments and how that nature-based feature perspective can help enhance some of these locations. But really, when you think about watershed assessments and watershed restoration, a systems approach, we really need to understand the landscape, the underlying geology, the climate, and in effectively developing a plan to restore, to stabilize, and in essence, bringing back the ecology and the biology. And so I'll leave it at that for this. We'll talk a lot more about that, Garrett. But this slide really kind of gives you an idea of how this canyon is laid out from a plan view perspective. It doesn't give us much idea on the elevation, but yeah, it's steeper in the upper part of the canyon.
Absolutely, and the physiography of this region is truly unique. You can see around the scale there where it says 1 mile. That's actually remnants of a dormant caldera complex. And essentially this area is comprised of a really poorly consolidated volcanic substrate, lots of pumice and highly erosive materials. And as you see, the effects of those during the floods was quite extensive. But prior to the fire, you can see this is that forest canopy. You can see the former fourth pond in the upper watershed, the caldera in the background in the upper right to the southwest. Very, very lush, vibrant community. And this is also a headwaters reach to the Rio Grande corridor. So these high elevation areas are critical source waters, not just for capture, but also storage. And these wetlands really act as a sponge and retain that water and allow for that sustainable flow during our drought periods, which we're experiencing quite frequently here in the Southwest. As we mentioned, the fires came in, and since '98, we've had 3 catastrophic fires that have started off reservation and encroached onto the Pueblo within the Pueblo boundary. Cumulatively, these have burned 80% of the tribal forests. The blue polygon there, the largest one, was the 2011 Las Conchas fire. That particular fire at the time was the largest in state history. It's since been eclipsed by 3 other fires. So to show you that, these aren't just one-off event. These large-scale mega fires, as they're sometimes referred to, are a very common occurrence in the Western U.S. and not just in North America or in Canada as well, but Australia and Asia, we're seeing similar effects from a warming climate combined with a lot of fuels management or mismanagement for the past century. As you can see, the results of this fire was a stand replacing crown fire. We lost, the majority of the forest. We were fortunate to retain a small ribbon of trees there. You can see in the image right on the valley floor. But even within that, you can see that white sediment, even at that time when that image was acquired 2 years after the fire, from the floods that really came through and inundated that whole riparian corridor. Some examples of the flooding. The upper left image in particular is my favorite, just because it really gives the context of what was going on. You have the main Santa Clara Creek in the bottom of the image where that log debris pile is. A tributary coming in above it with the sediment retention basin, completely inundated, overtopped. You have scour, incision, recreation infrastructure being demolished, roadways impacted, just a suite of events that are associated with these debris flows. In the lower right is just a screenshot that the governor took at the time when he was the forestry director. And this was just one of the several debris flows that came through. These debris flows resulted in 5 presidential disaster declarations as independent flood events, and continue to create an enormous safety hazard and challenge from a sediment mitigation perspective for the watershed. The image to the right with the red outlines was a geologic survey that was done in 2019. Within that tributary there, we had over 2 million cubic yards of sediment that were poised and still are hanging there and ready to come down during a future event. So how do we mitigate these hazards? How do we apply nature-based solutions and nature-based features to actually mitigate these moving forward is an enormous challenge. The 4 ponds I referenced before were all completely inundated and the dams were breached. This is an enormous structural and infrastructure challenge. A lot of these features didn't occur on bedrock. They weren't tied in as current dam safety standards now require. Additional seismic compatibility and other technical specifications really make these features infeasible in a lot of ways technically. So how can we look at alternatives and work with these to recreate some of these features using nature-based solutions that would not only work more in harmony with the environment, but also create cost-effective savings and really try to come up with a new approach to restoring this watershed.
Hey, Garrett.
So moving on, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, and so just a couple quick comments on the last couple slides here to give some perspective as far as the amount of erosion. Garrett mentioned one of the watersheds and the amount of material that have come off, but part of that was because of the actions of the fire and reducing that infiltration rate. And I think, Garrett, I can't remember exactly what that rate was, but it, like for the 100-year runoff, it increased the runoff rate by like 400% or something like that. It was some kind of really crazy type of number. And so the soils and the trees aren't there to, be able to absorb some of those flows. And so where on some of these tributaries, we may have had a channel that was a foot or 2 deep and maybe 4 feet wide. The channel degradation from the rapid runoff. Some of these channels now are 30 feet deep and maybe 40, 50, 60 feet wide in some cases. So just tremendous amounts of sediment and channel instability in the tributaries and on the main stem. It's one of those things that I think about. It's really hard to imagine until you actually see it in the field, because pictures don't do it justice.
Yeah, we'll see some of our restoration pictures and techniques we've applied. You'll see some examples of those incisions. But as Chris said, the scope of degradation within this watershed was massive. 20 to 40 foot incisions on these canyons was not just a one-off, but multiple tributaries, highlighting this extent of devastation is really prevalent. Again, it comes, I think, largely back to that poorly consolidated material, that substrate, being largely volcanic, but then also combined with the intense precipitation events we have during our monsoon season. We had an event last August where we received 1.75 inches of rain within 45 minutes. And the amount of mobility with the sediment was just staggering, even a decade after the fire. We're starting to see infiltration and vegetation recovery, but there's still a real safety challenge and hazard that we're trying to mitigate here. So to recover from these disasters, we really, the tribe has been remarkable in how they leverage collaboration, and we're seeing an increased emphasis. I believe the National Conference on Ecosystem Restoration last week the theme was collaboration, to have that landscape scale approach. Santa Clara started this in 2013, really. The fire was in 2011, but it really came forward with the introduction of the National Disaster Recovery Framework. This was developed in response to Hurricane Katrina And really having that disorganized response there led to this disaster recovery framework that brings all the partners to the table from across the federal, state, and non-governmental organizations, really putting everybody at the table, identifying their roles and their responsibilities, and staying up to speed with regular meetings and what's happening across these different projects and how they're working together. The governor is also very adamant about everybody who comes to the table brings a unique talent and purpose. And I included that quote from him just because that's something the tribe leverages and understands with people, whether it be a junior level student to a PhD researcher, it doesn't matter. He always encourages folks to speak up. So if you're ever in the area and want to come out for a site visit, feel free to reach out. We love hearing other perspectives and also sharing some of our successes. So with that, from that bringing together, we started understanding that there's a lot of expertise in different disciplines and a lot of them don't work together. And we really wanted to bring something that brought together the indigenous perspectives, but also these perspectives that we really identified with and worked, and we wanted to elaborate more on, and largely nature-based solutions and working with Chris in the U.S. Army Corps' Engineering with Nature program was central to that strategy. At the time, we started working with nature, working with natural materials, because that was indigenous knowledge. Those were the priorities of the tribe. We didn't necessarily know what to call them. We didn't know about nature-based solutions or bioengineering or engineering with nature. We just knew that it was good to work with nature. As these methods are now gaining traction, these terminologies are being reinforced with executive orders at the federal level, with UN mandates to increase working with nature. We're really seeing this sort of paradigm shift where folks understand that there's value there and how can we work with it. And so that we didn't know what we were doing at the time as far as a terminology perspective, but to see those strategies evolve into tie into what's going on now, it's really nice that we were at the forefront of a lot of this stuff and continue to innovate and push new methods forward. And with that, back to process-based restoration to end this slide with, that's ultimately what we're doing. We're looking at the natural processes on the landscape, identifying what's occurring whether it's an alluvial fan like Chris mentioned, or an incision, what do we want to let continue to do its thing? Where is there degradation that we actually need to identify, prioritize, and treat? And that's a continual challenge and continual operations that the Tribal Natural Resources Department pursue today. With that, though, this naturalistic approach is what we framed it back in 2018, 2017. And that really centered on focusing on the creek, prioritizing that stream above all the mitigation, above the infrastructure development, but then also understanding where there are opportunities or identifying opportunities to develop resilience for future events. How can we prevent the tribe from having to recover from future disasters to the extent they have to now? Addition to that, where are there opportunities to increase the cultural value, the ties to the landscape that have been disconnected from over a decade of no access to this watershed? It really took until 2021 when the canyon reopened just for tribal members for day use. Prior to that, there was a decade plus another decade from the 2000 fire with only a brief 2 to 3 year window where the members could come up. And what that's resulted in is an enormous cultural disconnect, primarily for the youth. There's kids who are now 14, 16 years old and have never been in the canyon, have never learned to hunt, have never learned to fish, have never gathered firewood with their family. And, they're resorting to video games and to unhealthy diets in a lot of cases. And how do we bridge that or reconnect that gap that's occurred is a big part. And it's just one aspect of the approach we have that is really centered on co-benefits and multi-benefits. Everything we do has a primary purpose, but we also learn where the other benefits come into that. And what we see is that when we prioritize nature in this process, we can integrate indigenous knowledge and nature-based solutions, process-based restoration, and increase the resilience, rebuild the infrastructure, develop water security, and ultimately reconnect that tie to the landscape for the tribe. So going into detail on a few of these, just the indigenous knowledge these are the lessons I've learned as a non-tribal member and working with the tribe, but they're very in tune with what's going on the landscape. Where is fire limiting weeds and invasive species? What's an alluvial fan doing at the base of this tributary and depositing sediment? And understanding where those are occurring, and then where you can facilitate or replicate them in other areas. It relies heavily on integrating natural materials and limiting the introduction of foreign materials, primarily concrete. This is something I learned my first, summer working with the tribe 8 years ago, excuse me. And that was that, Garrett, when we come in with this FEMA project and rebuild this bridge, limiting concrete is our #1 priority. We do not want to have that foreign material up in the upper watershed. That's our cultural hearth, and we want to keep it as pristine as possible. So understanding those priorities and then working with the engineers and being like, here, and they said, well, we don't know how to do this without concrete in a lot of cases. Okay, well then let's minimize it. What can we do? Maybe we can have a footer hold the structure together, but we don't have to have a giant precast concrete bottomless arch type culvert. So finding that balance and working with that indigenous knowledge and that Western science. And then again, the ultimate goal of these is to provide that resilience and that natural sustaining processes and balance for the long term. Process-based restoration, as some of you are familiar with, is also focused on restoring those physical processes, but it's more focused on the river and floodplain ecosystems. As we know, the degradation across North America is quite extensive. It's largely due to structural starvation and channelization of the courses of these streams, but also modification. There's a growing movement for the implementation of low-tech hand-built structures to help improve these environments, but we also see that those have limitations. And Chris was really critical about that at Santa Clara, that yes, the stuff you're doing is great, but you also need to be aware that these big precip events or larger scale, lower statistical probability events may still occur, and you have to have some resilience for those. So you either need to rely on some of those engineered structures, or possibly we could scale those up. And that's where Chris is like, let's build some of these structures, but let's do it with an excavator rather than with your hands. Use full length trees rather than just a 6-foot section somebody can pick up. So scaling those has been a big part of what we've been working with. Nature-based solutions, again, I have all 3 of these because they're synonymous in a lot of ways and they overlap. But again, you're maximizing ecosystem services, similar to recognizing those natural processes. You're really focusing on creating that habitat diversity and complexity across the landscape, but also developing resilience and understanding that patch of willows or that root wad you have on the stream bank is not only providing that habitat complexity, but it's also creating that surface roughness and deflecting the energy of the flood out to the center of the stream channel, so you have a more resilient stream bank or roadway embankment. And then this last bullet I included, because this is just tying from that local and national scale, which our talk is focused on, but also keeping that global context in mind and really working with the UN initiative to become nature positive by 2030. So right now we've come from this period where we're in this conquer or build and conquer and eliminate nature in a lot of the processes. Where can we do developments that integrate nature, have more green space, have more water retention within these environments, and go from a loss of nature to actually becoming nature positive in our developments. And I encourage all of you within not just your restoration projects, but working with your communities and working with your different engineering firms to identify opportunities where nature can be included. Chris, I'll hand this part over to you since this is more of the nature-based features component.
Yeah, thanks, Garrett. And just reiterating what Garrett went through on the last couple of slides with the traditional ecological knowledge and the process-based methodology, natural and nature-based features, and I know we've got a lot of acronyms, especially the Corps likes to make up acronyms, but a lot of these practices are very similar in effect traditional ecological knowledge is obviously based on the Pueblo and some of those inputs. So we're really learning from those aspects and how to use in situ materials and vegetation. And so that's been really paramount to kind of addressing some of this local source materials and applications. And then the process-based focus is, depending on the scale of the project and where you're at in that watershed, there's different processes going on, and there may be different anthropogenic resources that are kind of inflicting their damage to your site. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides later, but the NNBF Engineering with Nature perspective really started back in the late 2000s with some of the hurricane recovery efforts on the East Coast. And I don't want to go into a lot of details about that because that really doesn't have anything to do with our inland applications, other than what some of these studies were showing was the areas that had natural salt marshes and natural vegetation, there was a lot less damage locally from those hurricanes than areas that had been developed and severely limited those natural resources locally. And so really, just from a qualitative perspective, that makes sense, because when you have natural processes, you have wetlands, you have vegetation that can dissipate maybe storm surge from hurricanes. Those things really help to keep your area stable and help with the damage, to reduce the damage caused by what we would typically have from an anthropogenic perspective and the impacts we have on the environment. And so what NNBF and Engineering with Nature have really strived for, and I don't like to read words from a slide, but this phrase, the intentional alignment of natural, that's our traditional ecological knowledge, that's our process-based, and then engineering processes, because we need to understand how we can better apply those process-based perspectives from an engineering perspective to efficiently and sustainably deliver economic, environmental, and social benefits through collaboration. And really, Garrett's last 5 or 6 slides really kind of goes through that whole perspective from this phrase. And so some of the key elements we're looking at is science and engineering. How can we do operational efficiencies using process-based, using natural materials, and then natural processes? How can we integrate those natural processes into our engineering designs? And we can say engineering designs, but we're considering climate, we're considering geology, we're considering hydrology, hydraulics, geomorphology, ecology, biology. All these things are really what we want to do to understand those natural processes to incorporate projects. And so broadening the benefits, I think Garrett mentioned some kind of socio benefits as well. The Corps in the past has not been very good at really capturing those type of benefits. So how can we better capture those types of benefits for our projects? And then the last bullet there, science-based collaborative approaches. And Garrett has really fostered this from the Pueblo's perspective, with the Pueblo's input, is bringing the NGOs, bringing the federal agencies together in a collaborative approach, because again, some agencies don't talk to each other. Maybe state agencies don't necessarily talk with federal agencies, and so making those connections is really the best approach to being collaborative and making sure we're getting all we can out of our resources. Next slide, Garrett. And so this is just a figure that discusses those degrees of science and natural processes and benefits and collaboration. Each project's probably going to be a little bit different, and this could be within even the canyon, depending on where we're at from a kind of physiographic perspective in the canyon. Some places we may be able to use more natural processes up towards the top of the canyon where we have less restrictions, whereas if we go downstream to the alluvial fan location, we may have to tease that more towards a flood risk management perspective, because we've got the municipality there where we don't have as much freedom to allow those natural processes. Now, that doesn't mean we don't incorporate those natural processes where we can, but it's the realization that we may not be able to do that in the whole watershed, and optimizing those perspectives where we can. Next slide. And so this is some examples from the southern southeast part of the US, watershed assessment approaches where we've got degrading channels. The upper left and the upper right and lower right photos show some of the degradation, the degrading of the channel, which is exactly what happened after the wildfires in the Santa Clara Pueblo. But the degradation provides sediment, and this erosion rate progresses upstream, especially when we're in softer materials. And so the upper right-hand photo there is Crowder Creek in northern Mississippi. I was actually at this site last week teaching a class. And in the kind of the lower center of the photo there, you can see a car body. And this photo was taken back in the mid-'80s. And that car body kind of gives you a scale. This watershed above this car body and the two culverts is only about a 5 square mile watershed, so very small. But this channel has degraded and eroded up to these culverts and is probably 30 feet deep and 30 to 40 feet wide. And so just tremendous amounts of sediment when we're dealing with this degradation. And so there's opportunities to work with natural processes to bring these systems back up to some type or some form of stability. The lower left-hand photo is a project we're working on with the Ecuadorian government, and it's channel degradation at the max. It's about 150 meters of degradation working up from a failed waterfall. And that's progressing up to a hydropower plant, providing about 30% of the power to Ecuador. So that's another problem at a larger scale. But from a physical processes and a process-based approach, we need to work with those physical processes as best we can to stabilize these watersheds. Next slide. And some more examples. This is from central US, Illinois in particular. The left-hand photo there is showing some agricultural land, some typical erosion of an outside meander bend. We're looking upstream, and I'm actually standing on a bridge taking this photo. The restoration of this site actually wasn't channelization, and that's what a lot of folks want to do, is just channelize the reach through the bridge opening. The photo in the lower left is showing downstream, looking back up downstream towards that bridge. So what was done here was minimal toe protection that pulled the alignment of this bank out, and then some small stream barbs as well to redirect the flows. And then the outside meander bend, where it was a vertical bank and eroding, is now a reconnected floodplain with willows and other wetland plants. The tile line that you can see up in the upper left-hand photo there is now providing water and nutrients to that wetland that's being recycled before it gets to the channel and the actual water of Copper's Creek. So major benefits here by reintroducing this process-based approach to reintroducing a floodplain and all the benefits of a floodplain, nutrient recycling, stabilizing the channel, and also these tile outlets and revegetating the corridor. The upper right-hand photo is a minimal toe protection project. Again, this is not necessarily maybe a solid process-based, but if we were going to come in here with vegetation, we still have to have some kind of toe protection. And instead of shaping that entire bank back to a 3-to-1, if we use minimal materials, we can then stabilize these sections. This is obviously a critical meander bend. We're looking upstream in the upper right-hand photo. There's a house that needed to be protected. And then lower left is about 5 years later. in many cases, and I would say most cases, when we're using this minimal toe protection, you can come back 5, 10, 15 years later, and the riprap isn't even hardly visible because vegetation has taken over, sediments being deposited. So looking at these type of practices to really, really help us stabilize and provide more natural conditions. One of the things that could have been done with this project is locked logs or root wads or some other focused materials to get back in the system to provide macroinvertebrate habitat, to provide fish habitat. So there's always modifications we can do to some of these structures that are modifications in and of themselves. Next slide. And then grade control. This is, again, northern Mississippi up in the left-hand corner. A lot of structures back in the early 80s, mid 80s were put in. And this is a sheet pile cutoff wall. It looks very ugly, right? I mean, this is as far away from natural processes as we could get. And so the focus is really moving away from these type of structures and moving towards the upper right, where we use maybe minimal riprap materials to provide grade control in a stepped manner, instead of having all of the structure elevation in one location. It equalizes the energy slope across a longer distance, hence easier to hold structures, and then also provides fish passage. In the case here, this Red Banks project, you can see there's vegetation growing up through the rock materials as well. The lower right-hand photo you can see is looking upstream, and there's been berms that have been built back into this channel that was severely degraded, similar to the photos that I was showing in the previous degradation of some of the northern Mississippi streams. So just tremendous amounts of sediment. And the process-based approach here is that the actual channel builds back on its own edifice and provides these channel-forming discharge berms between these structures. And this particular series of structures was installed back in the mid-90s. So this project is well over 30 years old, 30 plus years. And then the lower left-hand photo there is a series of grade control structures that were put in Illinois to protect the Route 20 bridge between Dubuque, Iowa and Galena, Illinois. Again, these structures have been in since, I think, late 90s, early 2000s. Next slide. And then NNBF, again, using minimal toe protection, minimal structural perspectives, incorporating root wads, other woody materials, some typical design sections that we develop to stabilize and to provide that habitat. And really, ecologically, these are important for the local streams, and especially if you've got areas that have endangered species and you need to provide specific habitats. The lower right is what I think most people would understand as BDAs, beaver dam analogies. With the international guidelines work, EWN and international guidelines work, the Scots and the Brits have been doing these structures for probably about 5 to 10 years, and they call them leaky dams. And so that's, again, that process-based bringing back what is kind of referred to as a stage 0, where we have marshy, multi-channel locations, and the carbon sequestration, the opportunities to restore those wetland connections in the groundwater are tremendous. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. Next slide. And so probably my favorite slide. This is a figure that David Biedenhorn and myself are working on as far as some of the natural and nature-based features stream bank manual update documents. And what we're looking at here is the type of practice. And so on the right side is extremely hard engineering structures, and on the left side is more vegetative solutions where we can use just vegetation. And then the probability somewhere on that curve, most of the time we're in that kind of center section, or probably leaning towards the right because we have a lot of conservative designs, and it's maybe not convenient for us to tease towards the left side where we've got more vegetation. And so what we look at here is, are there ways that we can tease those hard designs and tease them back to the left where we're incorporating more vegetation, we're incorporating less hard materials, and then certainly materials that we have to haul in, right? If we can use in situ materials as part of your restoration, it cuts down on your cost. It makes things a lot more constructible. And from a traditional ecological perspective with the Santa Clara Pueblo, that was one of the perspectives they really wanted to use, was the local materials. And so again, how can we use this kind of description as to move our designs from the right to the left, and understanding those underlying physical processes. Just as an example, if we're in a severely degrading channel, we're not going to be able to tease too far to the left until we get that channel stabilized. And so in a degrading channel, if we can use grade control or some other methods to stabilize that channel, then as part of that component, can we bring in floodplain reconnection, more vegetation? And I think I know the answer is yes. We've just got to be more proactive in doing those type of applications. Next slide, Garrett. I think there might be two more. Yeah. So engineering performance. One of the things that ERDIC does from a research perspective is looking at levee setbacks, looking at naturalization of channel design, thinking about that process-based, and then watershed treatments. How do we assess a watershed, but then how do we come back and use our NNBF approaches? And again, we may have to tease towards the right where we're harder engineering, but what locations and what perspectives where we don't have maybe so much anthropogenic bridges and roadways and houses and industrial parks, can we tease things more towards the left? And these are all scale dependent, right? If you're in the top of the watershed, you may have less focused development, and maybe you can do some natural channel design, stage 0, where we're reincorporating multiple channels and floodplain connections and wetland complexes. And then levee setbacks, can we do that in maybe larger sections? Missouri River is a good example, which is what this photo is from. Can we provide more benefits from an ecological perspective, from a flood risk management perspective, and really mix those perspectives to get the best benefits? Next slide. And then this is just a list of kind of some of the documents. This 2016 document, we partnered with the U.S. Department of Interior Bureau of Reclamation for large woody material placements, and really incorporating the vegetative solutions. Again, from a scale perspective, how do we incorporate that in larger river systems, but then also how do we incorporate that across the landscape? Because we know there's major benefits when we incorporate woody materials for macroinvertebrate habitat, and the macroinvertebrate habitat helps the fish populations. And so there's the food web that we need to be thinking about when we're doing our designs. Next slide. And that's what this slide really shows, is that kind of systems approach. When we're going to be effective in designing projects, we have to be thinking about what's going on upstream and what's going on downstream, what our design might actually have impacts to for each direction, and then what might change upstream that could affect our project. And so thinking it as a holistic approach, and Garrett and the Pueblo have really embraced that approach with their planning and their projects and implementation. So yeah, I think we'll talk a little bit more about this, Garrett, as far as approaches and some additional slides here. And so this is I'm sorry, I think we skipped that. There we go. This is the approach that that was taken. And Garrett, you can chime in here if you want to take the lead on this one.
Yeah, just we thought this would be a nice follow-up slide from the last one, looking at, you know, the landscape perspective of these system-wide approaches and how Santa Clara has transitioned this to the watershed perspective. And working from the top of the watershed down is ultimately what became paramount to this particular image is actually from a culvert project, but really looking at that, if we're going to be replacing culverts in the system, what's occurred upstream, what's occurred downstream, where are the sediment sources, where are the depositional areas of concern, and how can we provide a more holistic approach to our project planning and design. With that, we've really developed a way of working from the top of the watershed down. We initially thought, okay, if we're going to restore the creek, we need to do this and upgrade this culvert and stabilize this bank. But the system was so dynamic and there's so much material moving through that it became imperative that we started working at the top of the watershed and treating those sediment sources where they began and working down the tributaries, working into the riparian corridor. And that alone took, you know, 7-8 years due to the severity of the fire. You know, there were permits and plans drawn and permits pulled to implement stream restoration. We go out and look, we're like, it'd be futile to invest this right now. It's just going to become inundated. You stand on these culverts and they sound almost like an old slot machine, with just the rocks going through and the amount of material moving. So that top-down approach was a strategy we developed internally to approach the watershed. And that started at the top, working with the existing fuel breaks and extending those to help manage the existing forests that didn't burn in the upper, 8% of the watershed. That extended to a lot of mastication and mulching efforts. How can we work with this woody debris, maybe accelerate the decomposition processes so we have quicker regeneration and stabilization? That extended into the tributaries with erosion control and sediment mitigation. And then, as I mentioned, eight years after, finally stream restoration, which we've been working on for the past 4 or 5 years. The vegetation fire management, as I mentioned, the fuel breaks, but also the hazardous fuel reduction, working with prescribed fires in our unburned fire forest, particularly in the lower Pajarito Plateau or out in the middle of the watershed, that wasn't as impacted by fire. How can we retain these last forested stands for seed regeneration and just forest cover and habitat for the species there? And working with fire and creating that resilience so those don't burn too in a large scale fire. After the fire and during the regeneration, we have a lot of invasive species coming in. How can we manage those more effectively with fire, with mechanical treatment, sometimes chemical treatment, and then also extending off of that with reforestation from conifer seedlings to shrubs and grass and foreplanting. A lot of the forestry department is focused on this reforestation component and how they can do this at the watershed scale. From 2016 to 2019, the tribe planted over 200,000 seedlings annually. We've since shifted from a quantity component to more of a quality component and finding these strategic opportunities for nucleation planting where you have sufficient soil moisture, sufficient organic matter, and you're going to have higher survivor rates. We try to focus on higher elevation areas where possible so that you have that natural gravitational dispersal that's also compounded with wildlife, primarily birds and seed dispersal that way. And then also with the water and the flood transport as well. We work both inside the watershed and also outside. As I mentioned, those 3 fires all encroach from non-tribal lands. So how can we work with our adjacent landowners and partners to develop co-stewardship agreements or co-management plans? We work with the U.S. Forest Service, the BLM, as well as the National Park Service to the west to help increase that co-stewardship on those adjacent lands. And then lastly, community involvement and public participation. For all of you, I recommend bringing that into your projects where possible. Not only does it increase public support and understanding for what you're doing out there, you can leverage community participation. You can extend that as a source of in-kind cost match. If you want to do sign-in sheets and assign an hourly rate to all your volunteers, great way to leverage resources. But then also for the long-term sustainability and stewardship of your program, making sure those projects are maintained, the trash is picked up. If there's problems, that it's communicated to the proper people. That public participation, I just really want to emphasize that. We do have some challenges in the watershed, primarily with grazing of both tribal cattle and trespass cattle. We do have certain areas like this on the left would be sort of a riparian nucleation site that we actually see high rates of soil moisture and regeneration. We can supplement that with additional planting, which we have. And I wish I had an after picture because this area is, over 3 meters tall with vegetation now and provides just great habitat and sustainability where we can remove the fence and actually have a self-sustaining ecosystem. With fencing, though, we try to integrate wildlife connectivity and having passages. This was one before. We actually removed the upper wire there holding those H-posts together so that animals could traverse through those areas. And when we work with metal fencing, we always recommend doing top and bottom strand smooth wire. There are wildlife crossing guidelines for fencing, plenty of them out there if you want to just do a simple search on that, where we're happy to provide those references. And then lastly, we're trying to move away from just doing fencing at all where necessary and working with natural materials. And actually, you can see at the top of that image on the left, there's a downed tree, and understanding that those branches create a natural deterrent for animals that come in. And so we can actually use that material or jackstrong effect over new plantings. And actually, we find that once those seedlings or plantings have taken hold, typically about 2 years, you can keep stuff off. They have enough resilience where they can come in and be browsed by deer, elk, or even cows in some cases. Transitioning more to some of the implementation for erosion control, as I mentioned, it's probably our primary activity for the first 8 years after fire. A lot of these recommendations were introduced by the burned area response team from DOI, and creating these rock dams, as you see on the left side there, that will catch sediment and minimize that transport, promote aggradation of these incised channels, but then also working at the middle, where can we stop these sources right where they start? That's an enormous head cut we have on one of our tributaries, and we didn't have any rocks there, so there was a lot of, okay, how can we use some of these low-tech principles, but not have the materials prescribed as in rock, but we have lots of burned timber. How can we innovate and adapt and work with these natural materials on site? It didn't make sense to haul in rock or fly it in. It wasn't cost feasible, but we had that wood. So working with that, and even from a primitive standpoint on the image on the right, where we're just strategically placing it inside these incised channels, and providing that scaffolding or that structure for that material to adhere to. And once it has that scaffolding, we find that material does not transport nearly as much. And additionally, we see that after these areas do aggrade over the next, depending on when your precip events are, but we find within 2 to 3 years, typically these areas aggrade anywhere from 20 to 60%. And then a year or two after that, we see the water table rebound with them. The vegetation comes back in, the wildlife component, it starts transitioning through. And it's just really nice to see these structures come from a low tech to a really high yield and high benefit result. We work a lot with standing timber and contour felling, which we call it, where you fall the trees perpendicular to the elevation gradient. We'll go in and manually pack dirt into these to promote to lessen the undercutting. This image on the right is from actually a private landowner on the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fire complex that occurred 2 summers ago now, which is now the largest fire in New Mexico history. But we went out there and provided some consulting on how we've dealt with some of these strategies and looked to see how they can implement them in other burn areas. This particular example, they actually seeded above the logs and then put straw over it to retain that soil moisture. And this image is, I believe, let me see, 5 weeks after the fire, and they've already got grass growing up, and the 2 weeks after they planted it. So pretty impressive to get that fast regeneration and try to increase that infiltration on the landscape. Just to show you the scale of some of these incisions that Chris mentioned earlier. This is about a 25-foot incision on the left there, with our guys dropping wood into it. Again, trying to provide that structure and scaffolding. Working with head cuts and these log mats and log mattresses up top there on the image left. It's also, we do a lot of trial and error, and yes, we have a lot of success, but we're also proud of like where we have mistakes and we learn from those. That adaptive management component is key to working with the landscape. For instance, this image on the right was the first sort of trash rack, they call them, or debris rack, put into a tributary. And I believe, Chris, you might have actually provided the feedback on that one of the limitations with that structure is that cross log is actually up above on the bankful bench on the terrace above the incision. And what that's going to do is it's going to provide aggradation up to that level, but it's going to create a new source of erosion. It's going to flank around it and create potentially new sources of sediment. And that when we build these structures, it's more important that we put them in. What we've learned to do is 50% of the depth of your incision or less, typically about 30 to 40% is where you want the height of those structures, so that they're grading a couple feet, but they're not going to create a massive level above and a huge grade differential below. And so to also supplement that, we'll put them in succession, as you can see in that image. And we'll have these in succession for over a dozen long, depending on the characteristics of the incision. We do a little bit of sediment management just for smaller flows and trying to direct and trying to get floodplains developed using similar structures like these. And then working from the valley-wide structures, there's been some gray infrastructure that's been introduced primarily with the Corps, but also even leveraging funds with the nature conservancies, where we're able to put in the geobrug, they call it debris fences or nets on the right. And that's a technique that was initially designed for avalanches in the Alps. And it's since been applied here in a post-fire context where these structures are actually providing a hazard mitigation for the roadway below. And they're actually designed where we can go in and empty them out if needed, or they can be maintained. Again, you're trying to limit the risk on the roadway in that scenario. Moving back to the upper left image, this is one of our valley-wide grade control structures that are intended to ultimately increase evacuation time for the community below. These structures were put in as a result of the transport time from the upper watershed to the community went from an hour and 45 minutes to less than 45 minutes. I'm sorry, not hour and 45, 3 hours and 45. So 3 to 4 hours of transport from the upper watershed to the community before in the stream environment. Post-fire, 45 minutes. And these debris flows were coming. They were cresting the bridge and the highway at the community. They were threatening the tribal administration building, the senior center, the community school, the elementary school, enormous threats to life and safety. And so to mitigate that, these valley-wide control structures were put in to attenuate the flood energy, essentially spread it out, provide a scour channel in that middle terrace there where that water can churn and then disperse at a slower rate. We had 3 of these structures put into the canyon, and they did fulfill their purpose, but they also were severely ecologically disconnected. And they're really this epitome of gray infrastructure. And the response that a lot of, no disrespect, Chris, but a lot of the way the Corps responds to these disasters is they come in with a single focus. We need to attenuate flood energy and increase evacuation time. Great. But what we look at now is how can these structures be improved, and how can we work with Chris and EWN and promote refinements in these where we can actually have a bankful channel that conveys the 1 to 2 year event, which we have 98, 99% of the time in the canyon. and have effective sediment transport, lower the maintenance requirements of cleaning out that scour trough, which the tribe has to do every other year now, at a cost of, $40,000 a structure. You're over 100K just in maintenance. So how can we look at these and potentially even evolve them to leverage that assistance from visitors we've had? We had a U.S. State Department tour from 8 countries in Southeast Asia, and we brought them in, and I said, "Here, this is what we deal with in this environment. How do you mitigate bank erosion and stability in the Himalaya and these deep incised gorges you have there?" And they says, "Yeah, it's very similar. Our mountains are 3,000 meters instead of 3,000 feet, but yes, here's what we do, and we use gabion rock, wire wrapped rock like you do in this debris dam here, and they'll set these gabion baskets down, and then they'll come in with a dump truck of topsoil and cover them, and then plant them with a flood resistant vegetation like willow or alder, and all of a sudden that by the time those roots come in and hold all that rock together, that wire can disintegrate and rust over time, and you turn a gray piece of infrastructure into a green infrastructure, or a nature-based solution in this case. We're like, wow, that's fascinating. We've never seen like a really like ecological application of gabion. But here we can look at this and say, hey, maybe we can convert these gabion dams to earthen berm dams that will retain that structural integrity and specifications to attenuate floods, so that if this watershed burns and floods in 300 years, it'll still provide that utility, but it won't be this eyesore. It'll have a bankful channel connected to it. We can create a series of grade control and step pools below that'll promote aquatic connectivity and fish passage. And all of a sudden, there might be a way to work with these structures rather than completely remove them. So that's really where that evolving and evolution and improvisation comes into the work we do. And it's also unique, we do have working in this area, like from non-tribal perspective, is fascinating, because it's a sovereign land that the tribe is very into promoting these nature-based solutions, and then there's opportunities to do that. We also have that flexibility, a little more flexibility to innovate, versus if we were trying to do this at a state park or another regional infrastructure that has another land governance behind it. So my hat's off to Santa Clara just to have that forward thinking and that openness to working with these solutions and working with partners like Chris and I to continue these advancements.
Hey, Garrett, just one real quick comment on this too, and I think you hit the nail on the head here with all of this. When we're talking about implementing these gabion valley grade control structures, the Albuquerque Core District was involved very early on to help with this type of flood risk management, and these structures are very ugly. I think in any environment they are ugly, and so it's not necessarily again at this point when this sediment was being delivered, the opportunity to collect this material and not have it go downstream to the flood risk management channel. And I think there was still problems down there, right, Garrett? And we'll go over that in the next slide. But I think the big focus from an engineering with nature perspective, as Garrett mentioned, is can we come back now and maybe it takes 5 years, maybe it takes 10 years, and it depends probably on the site, but can we come back now and do some modifications to these structures to make fish passage more applicable and to get rid of this ugliness in the on the landscape? And I think that's the big perspective that Garrett and I have been kind of hashing around and trying to figure out. So more to come on this, but really needed structures at the time because of just the scale of the problem. But now we can go back and maybe modify.
Yeah, I think the aesthetics component is a big part. Like, restoration folks come out and they see this structure and they're like, wow, I can't use the inappropriate term here, but it's an engineering output that is so disconnected. It's got gabion, it's got concrete, it's got flood mitigation, but then they're like, but there's zero concern for like what's happening with the fish in the system. And this is where it's unique that now that there's this federal initiative to really recognize the value of these, Governor Daveria and I are actually presenting to the Corps next month on their training session with about 60 of their cadets nationally that do the engineering on these structures, that do the environmental compliance, and we're able to show that there's new ways to look at this stuff. Like, yes, there's a lot of utility in this. It's not all bad, but maybe if we, just included that 1 to 2 year channel in there, created grade control below, so you're not disrupting that hydrologic or aquatic connectivity in the system, that these features can be done better. And then maybe even, from an earth and burn perspective, that could be a long-term maintenance or transition for these structures if they decide they don't want to remove them. So that's where the tribe is really still able to still leverage its expertise and experience from working with these and advocate for change at the federal level, which is not always easy to do. But right now, there's a lot of interest in improving and integrating these. We talked about flood risk and culverts. Conveyance is a huge part of our system. You can see we have like these box culverts here in the Pueblo Village. Again, they're all at the same level. If you're ever putting culverts in, offset one culvert to convey that 1 to 2 year event. If you have them all at the same level, they're going to degrade, they're going to reduce the capacity and the whole function of the intent of these culvert projects. So it's important to do that. In addition to the box culverts, with the box culverts, you can see in that lower right image, they actually expanded an additional box for the increased conveyance that they required through the system. There was grade control put in with those rocks, but it wasn't put in with a fish passage focus. And then in addition, you can see in that image left, what we call gabion baskets. And these are another temporary measure to extend the height of the levees within the Pueblo Village. And those are a combination of gabion and material fabric that contain just, sand and sediment, but increase the resilience of the community or the conveyance of that flood channel. Anything else there, Chris, you want to touch on?
Yeah, just real quickly, that they're actually called HESCO barriers, I think, and they're a little bit different from gabion baskets in that they have the fabric and you can use local materials to fill them in. They're connected so that you get a little bit of protection. That's not a great word to use, but flood risk mitigation potentially. So yeah, it was extensive here. And where we just last comment on this, and I know we've got a lot of slides to get through. Where we have degradation up in the upper part of the watershed, we're going to have aggradation, and this aggradation was occurring down in these the areas down on the alluvial fan. And so this is an area where we have very, very tight constraints on the stream corridor. So we're really limited here on a process based approach because we're so limited with space. So just one more case study. This one is from Boulder Creek, Colorado. You can see up in the upper left photo, there's a channelized reach, and most of this river has been channelized. In the lower left, there's some remeandering that occurred as part of the local conservation group and the Omaha District Corps of Engineers. Vegetation was and trees and logs and stuff were incorporated into this design with the remeandering and floodplain cutting and reconnection. Next slide. And so the upper left there is the existing condition. This is that channelized reach. The upper right is sections where they were cutting and remeandering so that the floodplain gets access to the frequent events. I think about a 1.5 year event is what it was. Post-project stabilization, vegetation. We haven't talked about tule, but there were some tules that were planted on the channel margins here, some native vegetation that comes in and provides stabilization with the root wads. And then the lower right, these are the crossover locations where they use the native materials on site to construct the riffle locations. So really good example of channel reconnection with the floodplain, remeandering, bringing back vegetation, and that floodplain reconnection with the benefits of groundwater and other aspects of nutrient cycling and stuff. Next slide.
I'll take this one, Chris, just because this is an
Okay.
example of where we worked with our engineers to incorporate some of these natural materials. We didn't want traditional riprap brought in. We wanted to use this woody debris. How can we have that in a stamped engineered drawing? We relied on resources from the Colorado Water Conservation Board, the EWN manual Chris mentioned earlier, as well as I believe FEMA has a few guidebooks as well. But showing that where these have been applied in other systems and can validate some of the structural integrity to these, really we're able to convince our engineers to integrate, to design these and eventually stamp these, which took years, but it was a big achievement to have that justification from the engineering standpoint. And then building that, we have highly erosive streams. We wanted to integrate rock. You can see on the right there, the rocks that we use to stabilize this watershed, as well as the dispersal of woody debris in the construction site. You'll see throughout these construction pictures is critical to developing that organic matter and those microhabitats for insects, as well as just intercepting that precipitation energy and reducing runoff. We work a lot in the stream now with rocks, trying to let the water do the work, or the Bill Zeedyke methodology of, trying to work with these systems and develop point bars and natural grade control. They're intended to either be, sustained for the long term when they overtop and vegetate, or sometimes they're just intended to help spread out the water so we can plant, increase that wetted perimeter, and have more resiliency on that riparian corridor. Examples of integrating logs. These are really pretty and they look good, but they all failed. And it's important to show so there's a question I'm trying to type an answer to here, but where did we tweak? Here, working with log drops. If you want to integrate log drops, you got to set them at least halfway below grade, or they will undercut eventually. They create a nice pool, but you gotta work, and that adaptive management is so key to what we do. With road crossings, we really try and prioritize fish passage first and natural stream meandering, floodplain connectivity, but then also integrating restoration above and below your infrastructure projects is a great opportunity to implement stream restoration. Here, we're really trying to work with maximizing the riparian corridor. And you can see in the image in the green up on the right, we integrated a log vein on the downstream outlet of that spring, another one with a bog on the other side, and essentially went from a narrow, 15 to 20 foot riparian corridor to one that extends now over 150 feet. Working with logs, if you're replacing culverts, you don't have to necessarily do a $750,000 bottomless arch type culvert. You can just buy a cylindrical culvert, maybe upsize it and put it below grade so you have a natural bottom component. And then also look at utilizing that stone we had available for stacked stone head walls. When I talked about that, extending that riparian corridor, this is a great example of it. You can see where we're taking these areas and recognizing there's aquatic potential there, and we can develop side channel pools and aquatic habitat, grade control, and again, increase the width and extent of that habitat, that riparian habitat. We're doing this now from a flood mitigation perspective. Instead of putting our sediment retention basins up in these tributaries, we're putting them right at the mouth of them near the stream and digging them so that we can actually connect them to the creek and create, new off-channel ponds that we can utilize for beaver recolonization, and they can actually sustain these for the long term. We go in, we're planting these during a workshop next week, actually, that will actually provide that forage for beaver to dam up the outlet and increase the surface area. That's just groundwater in this image. This image is the pond here extends past that heavy equipment. And then working with this off-channel pond concept, can we potentially mitigate the sediment in filling in these ponds by providing a flood corridor adjacent to it? Here's a conceptual rendering of what we're trying to do with one of those gabion dams, and using the elevated water table above the dam and still working with it as a dam of sorts, but then also providing a flood corridor on the far side of it. As I mentioned, we improvise, we look at a lot of things and see how things will function. This is just a scale model we built underneath that culvert after construction, just to see how sediment responds in these systems, what type of diversion structures we should include, and how this water will respond not just from a sediment perspective, but a water quality perspective, and how we want to be able, what capacity we need in being able to divert the stream. At the small scale, the beauty of these off-channel ponds is you can scale them to individual sites. As we can see here, this is a relic beaver pond that blew out. There was a shoebox sized channel flowing out with very little riparian cover. How can we go in and introduce some smaller manually excavated holes? So we have, we actually have 9 ponds in this 80-yard tributary now. And then working even with geotech, they make biodegradable geotech now that you can use to reinforce these where you don't have that rock or log structure. And that's that image on the right there with that black material. These transcend other wetland restoration projects throughout the country. Chris, do you want to elaborate on this? We have just a couple minutes, so we've got to jam.
Yeah. Just quickly, this is a project that was partnered with the TNC to look at restoration of some wetlands, increase wetland capability. The lower or the right-hand photo here is an existing wetland that had stop log structures in it, and so some of the species that were targeted are in the lower left of the photo here, but coming in and putting in some more kind of cut and fill shallow wetlands that could be controlled with these stop log structures, which is shown on the right. Next slide. And so this is an aerial view after construction. This was the next year, showing some of that variability and complexity, a little bit deeper spots, maybe 3 to 4 foot, but then tailoring off into really shallow zones, and then having it go across the floodplain and using all this area, kind of like a stage 0 concept, only with berms across this watershed. And next slide. Part of the focus was for this Nachusa grasslands wetlands complex was to reintroduce buffalo and the herd. And this is west of the Mississippi. So this is in Illinois around the Dixon area. Web link is there on the slide, which I believe will provide the slides after the presentation.
Sorry about that, Chris.
No, that's fine. That's in a nutshell. There's more to it, but there is a website, and I won't go into a lot of detail because I know we're tough on time here.
Okay. Yeah, so just to wrap up, what we're trying to do now at Santa Clara is try to ultimately create a new model of, can we build, 200 or 300 ponds in this system that historically only had 4 large open water bodies, and looking at how much evaporation is going on. It's easy to quantify the surface water, but the subsurface water is an issue. How do we maintain the water quality in these systems? As I mentioned, this is a back channel pond. Below here, you can see the algification occurring there. We planted it with willows. It's since become shaded, and that water has cleared up due to that water temperature difference. So working with these systems is continually an issue. Grazing management continues to be as well. And then also contractor proficiency. Be careful when you start these projects and you solicit for services. Every contractor will tell you they can do any of this stuff, but really be careful vetting them and look at their examples where they've implemented work. Trout Unlimited has experienced this right now in California quite extensively, where their contractors just aren't up to par with what they're trying to build. So going back and doing it correctly is key. And then I included build it like it was, because that's a tribal perspective we have, that people want it like it was because it was awesome. Like, well, don't change it. We want it like that. And trying to show that, maybe we can have, greater water storage and retention in the system with tons of fishing habitat, native cutthroat fishing opportunities, and habitat complexity and diversity, and that diversity, which ultimately results in increased cultural value. And when the folks come out and actually see this and understand it, they're like, wow, this is great. Yes, we're on board with this, versus, well, if we just hear about it, no, we want it like it was. So that's a challenge. So in conclusion, the principles that Chris and I covered today, from process-based restoration and nature-based solutions and nature-based features, but also integrating that indigenous knowledge and that perspective of living in harmony with nature can really lead to cost-effective strategies to mitigate disturbance, increase resilience. You can leverage partnerships. That collaboration is key to maximizing your treatment area and also lessening your funding burden on particular entities. There was something about monitoring. I'm still answering that question in the chat here, but maintaining flexibility throughout your projects through design. If there's contingency funds available in your grant, use it, whether you think you need it or not. There's going to be unforeseen costs that come up. Maintaining your design plans to be built to what we call field fit. So they'll have to be in that exact location. You can adjust them. That's key. And then adaptive management during your monitoring. How's this stuff responding? What do we need to do different? How can we change this to make it work? Again, public participation, as I mentioned earlier, and then really just trying to rely on those ecosystem services and what nature is putting out there and showing you that works and replicating it and facilitating that wherever you can. And ultimately, you will be nature positive. And I like to end with this quote from one of our techs because we were planting aspens along the creek. And he's like, you know, Garrett, why we're doing this, right, dog? And I said, yeah, to create shade so that we'll have colder temperatures. He's like, well, yeah, that too. He says, but ultimately, if it's good for the planet, it's ultimately good for us, right, dog? And I said, you're absolutely right, Santi. So just to convey that perspective, I like to bring him into the picture. So thank you all for today. And we have a couple references here that I'll leave you with. And if we can open it up for questions here for another, we're almost out of time, sorry.
So we are at just at 1:30. We will go ahead and ask a couple questions. If you can stay on, great. If you can't, the question and answers will be included in the recording. So let's just ask a couple of them. I know Garrett's been trying to answer some rapidly. Did you run into any regulatory hurdles with placing organic materials into a stream bed for stabilization?
The hurdle would be quantifying. They want to know how much material you're going to be using. So if you're doing a nationwide 27 for stream restoration and you're going to build, you're proposing to do 20 rock veins, you need to calculate the volume of rock per individual unit and then interpolate that for 20. I always recommend putting in, if you're going to build 20, put in 22 or 25 in your permit. Say, we're actually going to propose this, because that's that adaptive management and being able to be flexible and understand that, hey, maybe we underestimated how much grade we need to stabilize, but you can't add we've learned that like one of the hurdles is to go back and modify a permit is a lot more work than saying, hey, we proposed 23 structures, we only built 18. That's okay. It's just you can take them out, but you can't add them. So that's one of the challenges and way we navigated that. Next
Okay.
Any other questions?
How about, have you had problems with invasive plant control as a part of the project?
Yes, continually, both aquatic and terrestrial, whether they're introduced from cows or equipment from other areas. The tribe has limited resources, so the same excavator we use in the creek needs to go down to the Rio Grande and clear the irrigation diversion, making sure you're either power washing or keep letting things dry out. After fire in these erosive environments, there's certain invasives that are really opportunistic and come in, whether they be species of thistle. We have numerous species that we work with. Some, though, we've learned are considered invasive, but are sort of natural and successional and opportunistic, as I mentioned. We'll have really prevalent cases for a year or two. We're like, oh my gosh, they're going to take over. Then 3-4 years that they subside. So keeping that context is also important when you look at
one comment on that too, Garrett. Just to had a couple projects, making sure that we're really confident in the seed source we have. We've had some projects where the actual invasives were brought in with the seed source for restoration. So making sure that we've got good access to good seed and sources.
Yeah.
What species and biotype of grass was planted behind the burned logs with straw?
I just saw that, and I honestly don't know on that one. That
Okay,
wasn't on Santa Clara land. That was the one example I included from another area. That's what the landowner used for just a local source grass seed. Just you'd want to identify what species are native to your area and try and work with those. The NRCS is a great resource for that.
okay. And then, Chris, you mentioned a structure, HESCO barriers. Is that the cylindrical structure that was in the image?
So the HESCO baskets or bastions
Basket.
are, those were the structures that were tied together along the top of that. I guess it was the stream bank there, just down in the alluvial channel, or alluvial fan channel. And so it was on both sides. And those structures are filled typically with fabric so that they can then be filled with local sand or rock or, smaller materials.
Okay. And just two more, and I think we've handled them all. Would you recommend any of these erosion techniques in the areas of dam removal where large amounts of sediment suddenly become available to a system?
Yes, if you're looking for aggradation and floodplain development, I would consider like large woody debris or root balls with at least 20-foot stems on them. But there's also like kind of need to let a lot of that stuff flush through. And anytime you can find an area to a grade and develop that, I would key into those. Alluvial fans are your best bets. But when that sediment is coming from a dam basin, and being transported down, it needs to move. And anytime you can promote a natural channel with a floodplain connectivity is going to be your best bet. Other than that, you're going to probably need to manually excavate some of that system. You can't do all of that either. There's too much sediment. We find roadways are the best way to use that sediment because there's so much of it. Otherwise, you just have to transport it through the system and try and find opportunities to grade on floodplains. It's a big challenge right now in the Klamath right now with the dam removal up there I'm aware of. So yeah, it's dynamic, but after a couple of years of that, it finds that equilibrium and starts to stabilize itself ultimately.
Okay, last question. Explain the scour and deposition you've seen around wood and root wad installations, also any geomorphic change associated with their locations.
Oh man, this might be my favorite thing to see in the field. Chris, do you mind if I answer this?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Man, you see, I mean, I mentioned surface roughness, and when you create that complexity and that woody debris in the system, and that water is able to bounce off or be deflected from it, you'll get a lot of scour initially right next to the feature, but immediately adjacent. Those scour pools, depending on the size of the system you're in, but those scour pools the scour depths tend to be flanked by the deposition of fines, which creates really great spawning habitat for trout and cutthroat in particular, or reds they call them. So you see this change of, you might have increased scour in one spot, but a few feet over, you'll have a nice deposition and a nice sandbar that's continually sorting and being a great nutrient source for aquatics to develop. Again, Chris mentioned the macroinvertebrates that are able to adhere to these systems. They're not in the high energy scour zones, but adjacent or underneath the locks. They're great. You're creating that complexity, geomorphologically and hydrologically in that system where sediment's getting sorted and transported, and different velocities are going to equate to different types of habitat and places to hide for fish. So it's like ecology. There's a lot of everything going on everywhere all the time when you integrate that wood, but that's the beauty of that complexity. The geomorphic changes beyond that, again, it's you're deflecting that energy, that high energy environment away from your stream bank, and keep stabilizing that bank. But you got to also be careful, like where you want that energy to go. Do you want that energy to stay concise and have induced meandering, or do you want to just have one deflection and then have it spread out? So you're developing a point bar and really working with that natural channel design and understanding where that natural stream channel wants to be is key to integrating that stuff. Otherwise, you might have adverse effects as well.
Well, thank you for making very short work of this,
yes.
I'm sure, very complicated question. So thank you everyone for hanging in there with us. I know we ran a little late, but these were really great questions, and I know the content was so rich. So thank you, Chris. Thank you, Garrett, for joining us today. I hope you'll come back for Tuesday, May 7th, when Reed talks about some of the practical strategies. So thanks again, and I hope to see you at another program soon. Bye.